The auctioneer's gavel was already in the air when the little girl stepped forward. She was no taller than the rail that separated the bidders from the auction table. Her coat was too big for her shoulders. Her boots were dusted white from the road, and in her arms she held an old leather ledger nearly half her size. For a moment, nobody noticed her. The men in the barn were too busy watching the banker. Thomas Greer stood near the front with his gloved hands folded over the silver head of his cane. He had the calm smile of a man who believed the day had already gone his way. Across from him, on a wooden chair near the wall, sat Mrs. Clara Whitcomb. She had lived on that farm for 41 years. She had buried her husband behind the east pasture. She had planted every apple tree beside the lane. She had fed neighbors during 2 hard winters and never once asked them to pay her back. But that morning her farm was being sold, and nobody in the auction barn had stopped it. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Final call," he said. "Whitcomb Farm, 87 acres, house, barn, pasture, orchard, and equipment." Mrs. Whitcomb lowered her eyes. The banker smiled. Then the little girl raised one hand. "Wait," she said. At first the barn only murmured. Then someone laughed. The auctioneer looked down from his platform. "Child, this is not a place for games." The girl tightened her arms around the ledger. "My father wrote this down before he died," she said. "You can't sell her farm yet." A few men near the cattle gate burst out laughing. One of them slapped his knee. Another pointed at the book in her arms. The banker turned slowly, his smile widening. "Is that so?" he said. "And who exactly is your father?" The girl swallowed. "Samuel Harper." The laughter quieted slightly. Samuel Harper had been the seed man for half the county. He had known which fields held water after a dry spring. He knew which corn would take root in clay, and which beans could survive a cold April. Farmers trusted him because Samuel Harper never guessed when he could measure, and never promised what he couldn't write down. But Samuel had died the previous winter, leaving behind one daughter, one wagon, and a locked cabinet full of ledgers. The banker looked at the little girl again. "Well, Miss Harper," he said, "your father sold seed. He didn't own this farm, and this auction will continue. And if stories like this remind you that courage can come from the quietest person in the room, stay with us here at Willow Field Stories. We tell stories about kindness, family, and the kind of strength that keeps a community standing when everything else begins to fall." The girl stepped closer. "My father said if Mrs. Whitcomb ever needed this, I should bring it before the gavel fell." The auctioneer frowned. The banker's smile thinned, and Mrs. Whitcomb, who had been staring at the floor, looked up for the first time. The girl placed the ledger on the auction table. Its leather cover was cracked. The corners were worn soft from years of hands and weather. A faded strip of cloth marked a page near the back. The auctioneer looked at the book, then at the girl. "What is this supposed to be?" She opened it carefully. "It's my father's account book," she said, "but not just for seed." The banker gave a short laugh. "There is no legal standing in a seed account book." The men behind him chuckled again, but the girl did not move. She turned the ledger toward the auctioneer and pointed to a page covered in her father's handwriting. The barn settled into a curious silence. The auctioneer leaned closer. At the top of the page were 2 names: Samuel Harper, Elias Whitcomb, Mrs. Whitcomb's late husband. The auctioneer's eyes moved down the page. There were dates: seed deliveries, corn shares, wheat sacks, orchard yields, notes in the margin, payments recorded not in dollars but in bushels, labor, and crop portions. The banker tapped his cane once on the floor. "Old farm notes," he said. "Sentimental, maybe. Irrelevant, certainly." The girl looked at him. My father said men say that when they hope, nobody reads to the end. A few people in the barn turned. For the first time that morning, the banker stopped smiling. Mrs. Whitcomb gripped the edge of her chair. The auctioneer ran his finger down the page. "What am I looking for?" "The folded paper," the girl said. He turned another page. There, tucked deep into the binding, was a yellowed receipt folded into thirds. The girl reached for it, but the auctioneer raised a hand. "I'll take it." He unfolded the paper slowly. The barn went quiet enough to hear the wind push dust against the walls. The receipt was dated 9 years earlier. It listed the Whitcomb farm, the spring crop advance, the seed and supply debt, and a settlement arrangement between Elias Whitcomb and Greer County Bank. At the bottom was a signature, Thomas Greer. The banker stepped forward. "That is a routine receipt." The auctioneer kept reading. His face changed. The girl watched him, her small hands clasped in front of her coat. "What does it say?" Someone called from the back. The auctioneer did not answer right away. Then he looked at Thomas Greer. "It says the spring debt was to be credited by crop share over 3 harvests." Mrs. Whitcomb slowly stood. "That was Elias's arrangement," she whispered. "He said Thomas gave him time after the hailstorm." The banker's jaw tightened. "And if you will read carefully," he said, "you will see that an arrangement is not the same as payment." The girl turned the ledger pages again. "My father recorded the deliveries." She pointed to a column of numbers. "First harvest, second harvest, third harvest." The auctioneer leaned down again. There were dates beside each entry. Wagon counts, sack weights, field notes, even the names of men who had helped load the grain. A man near the side wall shifted his hat. "I remember that second delivery," he said quietly. "I drove one of the wagons." The banker turned sharply. No one spoke. The girl looked toward the man. "My father wrote your name too, Mr. Larkin." The man blinked. She turned the ledger so he could see. His name was there. Caleb Larkin, West Wagon, 38 sacks. The barn changed then. Not loudly, not all at once. But the laughter that had filled the place only minutes earlier disappeared. The auctioneer's gavel lowered to the table. Thomas Greer took 2 steps forward. "This is absurd," he said. "A dead seed merchant's notes do not override bank records." "No," the girl said. She reached into the back of the ledger and pulled out one more folded page. "But my father said this might." The banker's eyes locked onto it. For the first time, he looked less like a man running an auction and more like a man watching a door open that he had nailed shut years before. The girl handed the page to the auctioneer. It was not a receipt. It was a letter, written in Samuel Harper's careful hand. The auctioneer read the first line aloud. "If Clara Whitcomb is ever brought to sale over the spring debt, this ledger must be opened before witnesses." Mrs. Whitcomb covered her mouth. The auctioneer continued. "Elias paid what he could in crop, as agreed. I measured, weighed, and recorded each delivery myself. Mr. Greer accepted the first 2 deliveries and signed the original receipt. This is the kind of story we believe is worth remembering. The kind where ordinary people, old promises, and forgotten acts of kindness still matter. If you believe rural stories like these deserve to be kept alive, you're part of the Willow Field community already." The third was delivered during the flood week when the bank office was closed, but the grain was stored in the county warehouse under clerk notice. A murmur spread through the barn. The banker's face flushed. "That is hearsay." The girl looked at him. "My father knew you would say that." The auctioneer turned the page over. On the back, beneath Samuel Harper's writing, were 2 initials and a county stamp. The auctioneer stared at it. Then he said one name, Daniel Price, the old county clerk. A few men in the barn looked at each other. Daniel Price had been gone for 3 years, but his mark had settled more land disputes in that county than any lawyer. The auctioneer read the notation. Received under storm closure. Crop share delivery logged for Whitcomb Greer settlement. The banker reached for the paper. The auctioneer pulled it back. This stays on the table. Thomas Greer's voice dropped. You are making a mistake. No, said a voice from the side. Everyone turned. Mrs. Whitcomb had stepped forward. Her hands were trembling, but her voice was clear. No, he is not. She looked at the little girl, then at the ledger. Samuel came to my porch after Elias died, she said. I remember it now. He told me not to throw anything away. He said some promises need witnesses. The girl's eyes filled, but she did not cry. My father said Mrs. Whitcomb fed us when Mama was sick. Mrs. Whitcomb pressed one hand to her chest. He never told me that. He wrote it down, the girl said. She turned to another page near the front. There, in the margin beside an old entry for seed corn, Samuel Harper had written a note. Clara sent soup again. Would not take money. Remember this. For a long moment, nobody in the barn seemed to know where to look. The men who had laughed at the girl lowered their eyes. One by one, the faces in the auction barn changed. They had arrived that morning to watch a farm be sold. Some had come out of curiosity. Some had come hoping to buy equipment cheaply. Some had come because there was always a crowd when someone else's life was being taken apart. But now they were standing in front of a child, holding proof that the woman they had all failed to defend had not been careless, dishonest, or behind. She had been forgotten, and one dead seed man had remembered. The banker tried once more. This auction was legally posted, he said. You cannot stop a sale because of an emotional display. The auctioneer looked at the receipt, then the ledger, then the county clerk's initials. I can stop a sale when the debt claim is in question. Thomas Greer's face hardened. That farm belongs to the bank until proven otherwise. A quiet voice answered from the back. No, Thomas. It belongs to Clara until you prove it doesn't. It was Caleb Larkin, the man who had driven the second wagon. He stepped forward, hat in hand. I hauled 38 sacks that year. Samuel weighed them. Elias said they were going toward the bank debt. Another farmer moved beside him. I was there for the first delivery, he said. Greer signed for it himself. A third man spoke. My brother worked the county warehouse during the flood. He said Whitcomb Grain sat there 3 weeks waiting for the bank to reopen. The auction barn, which had laughed at one little girl, now began to remember. Not because memory had failed them, but because it had been easier not to. Mrs. Whitcomb looked around the room. She did not look angry. That almost made it worse. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes when a person realizes they had not been alone because nobody knew. They had known enough. They had simply stayed quiet. The auctioneer folded the receipt carefully. Before what happened next changed the whole room, remember this. Sometimes the truth does not arrive loudly. Sometimes it comes in the hands of someone everyone else overlooked. This sale is suspended, he said. The banker snapped his head toward him. You do not have the authority. I have the responsibility, the auctioneer said, and I will not sell land under a disputed claim with witnesses present and clerk-marked records on the table. The gavel came down, but not to sell the farm, to stop the auction. The sound cracked through the barn like a board breaking. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Whitcomb sat down as if her knees had finally remembered how old she was. The girl picked up the ledger and walked to her. She did not smile. Not yet. She simply held the book out. Mrs. Whitcomb took it with both hands. "Your father kept all this?" The girl nodded. "He said numbers could be a kind of kindness if you wrote them down for someone who might need them later." Mrs. Whitcomb opened the ledger and touched Samuel Harper's handwriting with 2 fingers. "I thought the world had forgotten Elias," she said. "No," the girl whispered. "My father didn't." The crowd began to move, but not toward the exits. A woman came first with a basket of biscuits she had meant to sell outside. Then Caleb Larkin came with his hat pressed to his chest. "I should have spoken sooner, Clara." Mrs. Whitcomb looked up at him. "Yes," she said gently. "You should have." The words landed harder because she did not raise her voice. Another man stepped forward. "I can bring the old warehouse logs. My brother kept copies." The feed store owner said he still had duplicate tickets from the grain deliveries. The blacksmith said he remembered repairing the wheel on the Whitcomb wagon after the second load. Piece by piece, the town began to rebuild what silence had almost let the bank take. Thomas Greer stood alone near the auction table. No one blocked his way. No one shouted. No one needed to. For the first time that morning, he was the one everyone watched, and he did not like how it felt. He picked up his hat and walked out into the bright yard without saying another word. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass beside the barn. Inside, Mrs. Whitcomb held the ledger in her lap as though it were something alive. The girl sat beside her. "You were very brave," Mrs. Whitcomb said. The girl shook her head. "I was scared." "That doesn't mean you weren't brave." The girl looked down at her boots. "They laughed at me." Mrs. Whitcomb reached for her hand. "They laughed because they thought small things couldn't carry great weight." She touched the ledger. They were wrong. By late afternoon, the auction signs had come down. The farm was not saved forever that day. Not completely. There would still be papers to file, records to bring, and men in offices who would pretend confusion was the same as innocence. But the sale had been stopped. The truth had a witness. And Mrs. Whitcomb had time. Sometimes that is the first miracle a person needs. Not a rescue, not a fortune. Just enough time for the truth to catch up. 3 days later, the county office opened the old warehouse books. The third crop share delivery was there, logged during flood closure, marked for the Whitcomb Greer settlement, stamped by Daniel Price, and beside it in the margin one short note, verified by S. Harper. Samuel Harper had known. He had known men with power could misplace what poor people could not afford to lose. So he wrote it down. Every sack, every date, every promise, every act of kindness that someone might later try to call nothing. Within 2 weeks, the bank withdrew the auction notice. They called it a clerical matter. The town called it something else. They called it shame. But Mrs. Whitcomb never used that word. She simply opened her kitchen again. The first Sunday after the auction, she cooked stew for anyone who came by. Caleb Larkin arrived, with flour. The feed store owner brought coffee. The blacksmith brought a repaired hinge for her barn door. And the little girl came last, walking up the lane with the ledger wrapped in cloth. Mrs. Whitcomb met her on the porch. "You don't have to bring that every time," she said. The girl held it out. "I thought maybe you should keep it now." Mrs. Whitcomb stared at the book. Then she shook her head. "No, child, that belongs to you." "But it saved your farm." Mrs. Whitcomb smiled softly. "No, your father saved my farm, and you carried his courage into that barn." The girl looked toward the fields. The apple trees were just beginning to turn green at the ends of their branches. "My father used to say every farm keeps a memory," she said. Mrs. Whitcomb nodded. He was right. Then she placed her hand over the ledger. But some memories need someone brave enough to open the book. Years later, people in that county still talked about the day the little Harper girl stopped an auction. Some told it as a story about a crooked bank. Some told it as a story about a widow who almost lost everything. Some told it as a story about a little girl everyone laughed at until the laughing stopped. But those who remembered it best told it differently. They said it was the day a town learned that kindness is not weak just because it is quiet. That records matter when memory becomes convenient. That a promise written down by an honest man can outlive him. And that sometimes the smallest person in the room is carrying the only truth big enough to stop the gavel. Mrs. Whitcomb kept her farm. Ellie Harper kept her father's ledger. And every spring after that, when the first seed went into the ground, Mrs. Whitcomb would invite Ellie to the east field. Together they would open the ledger to a blank page. And Ellie would write one new line. Not because anyone owed them, not because a bank might come again, but because her father had taught her something the whole town never forgot. A farm is more than land. A promise is more than words. A farm is more than land. A promise is more than words. And sometimes the harvest that saves you was planted by someone who loved you long before you knew you would need it. Thank you for spending this story with us here at Willow Field Stories. If it moved you, like the video, share it with someone who still believes in kindness, and subscribe for more stories of courage, legacy, and the rural hearts that refuse to give up.